Welcome to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series, held here at the Museum of Nebraska History on the third Thursday of each month. A detailed schedule for this series, as well as information about all the Historical Society's programs and services, can be found on our website, nebraskahistory.org. My name is John Lindahl. I'm in statewide services here at the Museum of Nebraska History. And before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. The financial support that they give us allows us to broadcast these programs to a large audience on public access television. Our speaker today is Dr. Larry Walklin, and his topic is the Nebraska Broadcasters Association Hall of Fame. Larry Walklin is the Fred and Gladys Seaton Professor of Broadcasting in the College of Journalism and Mass Communications at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He's a native of Grand Island, and he got his first job in commercial broadcasting in Grand Island at the age of 16. His undergraduate degree is from Kansas State University, his master's degree from Michigan State University, and his PhD is from the University of Iowa. At the university, he's been manager of radio station KRNU-FM and a senior producer on the staff of KUON-TV. He's a past president and chair of the board of directors of the Nebraska Broadcasters Association. He is the current chair of the NBA Hall of Fame Committee. Professor Walklin also has been a member of the First Amendment Committee of the National Association of Broadcasters, a member of the Board of Directors of the International Radio Television News Directors Association, and head of the Radio Television Division of the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communications. He is the principal investigator of the Nebraska Broadcasting History Project. Please welcome Dr. Larry Walklin.
Thank you, John. It's always a pleasure to be here, fellow Nebraskans. I am a fourth-generation Nebraskan. My wife is a fourth-generation Nebraskan. That makes our kids the fifth-generation Nebraskans, I guess. So despite the fact that if you heard something about my intro, you know that in essence we're in a set of circumstances in which we know something about the state, have an appreciation of the state, and the kinds of things that are part of that. Special thanks to Paul Eislaffel, who is the individual in charge of the recordings and photographic records for the State Historical Society. Paul is a leader nationally, as you may know, in this particular area. He and I talk about some things in terms of recordings over a period of time, and we do not know that any other Broadcasters Association and university are as interested in these items, and the collection of the Nebraska State Historical Society is, at least as far as I can understand it, far ahead of the kinds of things that are part and parcel of what the normal circumstances would happen to be over a period of time. And since 1978, the Nebraska Broadcasters Association has deposited the records of their awards contest in the State Historical Society. And 1978 probably doesn't seem that far back to many of us, but at the same time you look at it and you say, well, that's a number of years now, and again, it's a situation where we think that's kind of the way to go in Nebraska, and sometimes we don't probably appreciate the fact that in Nebraska we are ahead of what the national curve is as a part of that. When I was asked to talk about the Nebraska Broadcasters Association Hall of Fame, that seemed like a logical set of circumstances because I'm the chair of the Hall of Fame committee as a part of that. It's a really fun opportunity because you get to look at the historical records of some individuals who have made major contributions to our state through broadcasting. And the set of circumstances that you deal with that, and you say, well, these people are folks who are kind of sort of recent in terms of the period of time. You go back over a long period and try to figure out where these things work. Now, broadcasting, of course, is a relatively recent innovation in terms of the way that the world operates. The broadcasting as a radio entity started in Lincoln at the university in 1899. You heard that I'm part of the College of Journalism and Mass Communications. Journalism education started at the University of Nebraska in 1894. That means the University of Nebraska is one of the oldest programs dealing with the formal study of the mass media. And that also means that, according to the records that we have access to at this stage of the game, that there are only 3 other universities that were experimenting with radio prior to the time that the University of Nebraska got into this in 1899. Now, you all know something about historical perspectives, and you realize that during the period from 1899, 1900 along the line through the end of World War I, there was, and is in many cases, a sort of a freeze on the electronic delivery of materials. They were devoted to the war effort. So it comes up to the university coming out with 9YY, which was the experimental station that they operated starting in 1920, and then moving over to the first university radio station, WFAV, in 1922 through 1926. If you are following Nebraska broadcasting history, you know that there is still a W prefix station in Nebraska. W is the prefix generally that the government assigns to stations east of the Mississippi River. K is the prefix assigned to the west of the Mississippi River. But we still have WJAG in Norfolk. It went on the air in 1922 and has been in operation, owned by the same family corporation. It's allied with Norfolk Daily News since that time. And arguably, that's one of the oldest continual ownership operations in the United States, and it is, of course, that I point out to your set of circumstances here in Nebraska. The kind of consideration which you think about when you deal with these kinds of historical circumstances, what you say to yourself is, I could probably do an hour on just radio in Lincoln, or I could probably just do an hour on television in Omaha, or I could probably do just an hour on even a couple of stations as a part of it. So this is what one of my colleagues refers to as a windshield tour of the Hall of Fame, as well as some other circumstances. And one of my students said, well, what does that mean? What does that windshield tour mean? And I said, well, it means you come to Lincoln, Nebraska, and somebody says to you, have you seen the state capitol? And you say, yes, I have. I drove by it at 40 miles an hour. So yes, I can see that I have seen the state capitol. Now, is that the same thing as getting out of the car and walking through and looking at the murals and understanding the historic preservation, the kinds of things that are part of it? The answer is, of course, it is not. So when you look at some of the kinds of things that we're going to deal with here, and you say to yourself, well, I'd like to be interested in some other stations or personalities or considerations, well, I invite you to bring up some of those questions at the end of the time, and we'll see if we can relate to that information. The Nebraska Broadcasters Association, as a professional trade organization, is the second oldest state association in the United States. It goes back to 1934. And you say, well, that's a ways after 1922. You're just talking about that. And the answer to that's true, although there were numbers of stations that went on the air and went off the air very quickly in that period of time. If you looked at that, you see that many merchants decided they ought to have a radio license. So that would be the so-and-so furniture store or the so-and-so car dealership or whatever. And most of the radio stations, when they got into them, found out that they were work. And it took a lot to be able to get program content on the stations, and so as a result they didn't spend enough time to be able to deal with this. I had a discussion with an individual outside the state, a very prominent broadcasting person, and he was talking about how his father had put on a station. This person is a multi-millionaire, and he said that the biggest problem was when his father put on the station in the 1920s was to go around and beg people to come on the station to do something, to be in the band or to do other things or make a presentation or talk or some set of entertainment that they could provide something out there so when people turned across the dial they could be able to find that kind of information. But the association as it stands, then, it's one of the oldest associations in the country, and it has a great deal of tradition. It has a great deal of tradition in a couple of ways, one of which is that it is one that has enforced standards of social responsibility. Broadcasters in the state of Nebraska are very socially responsible in terms of kinds of things they do. And the other consideration is that it is politically very active. So when it's politically very active, you can find that in this state there are wonderful open freedom of records, freedom of meetings laws, open meetings laws, in cooperation with the Nebraska Press Association. The Nebraska Broadcasters Association spends a fair amount of effort and money to being able to do that. The social responsibility, for example, comes, we have a couple of things that you may be familiar with, one of which is the governor's call-in show. The governor of the state, no matter who that governor happens to be, generally has to agree to show up once a month and have people call in and talk to them. That's on about 40 stations. We have a drug awareness campaign, which my wife Karen, who's in the audience, is the person who operates that, and they, over the period of time of 16 years of that campaign, have given 25,000 free spots per year combating substance abuse of all kinds. Now, that's social responsibility done on the professional level and through the mass media, which is the sort of thing that we in Nebraska all sort of take for granted. We kind of think that's the way you're supposed to behave yourself, but that's not necessarily the circumstances that you'll find. And if you've been in other parts of the country, lived in other parts of the country, visited other parts of the country, you do not anticipate that that's the sort of thing that happens. The Nebraska Broadcasters Association Hall of Fame was put together in 1972. And it was put together for a variety of reasons, probably because the leadership at that time, Roger Larson, whom some of you know, who was then the general manager of KFOR in Lincoln, and a man named Bob Schinelli, who was the general manager of KGIN TV in Grand Island, appeared on Channel 10 regularly for many years doing the news, were the folks who were in charge of the association at that point, and they decided that what they would try to do would be to organize this particular effort. Just to show you again, that seems like it's a long time ago in some sorts of circumstances. It's not a long time ago in terms of the overall world, but we just dealt with the folks in Oregon last year. They're thinking about setting up something like this kind of recognition now. And so again, it's a situation where in Nebraska we anticipate this is the way that the world operates, and we should provide this kind of recognition, but we do not necessarily find that that's the thing that other people do as a part of that. Now, the question usually comes up, who is responsible, who is eligible to be in the Nebraska Broadcasters Association Hall of Fame? I mean, where do these people come from? And the answer is, according to the rules that were set forth, is that they need to be somebody who is from Nebraska and has been a professional broadcaster, worked professionally in the business. This is over-the-air, federally licensed radio and television. It's not cable television. And it's not the kind of situation that has to do with satellite-delivered television. It is over-the-air broadcasting. Now, it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with those other areas, and people move back and forth among those, but that's the definition of this particular frame of reference. Or it can be someone who is from Nebraska, but who probably has made his or her mark outside the state on the national level. Dick Cavett is in town. He is a person who, of course, is from Nebraska, born in Gibbon, grew up in Grand Island for a while, graduated from Lincoln High School, and he is a person who, however, probably has considered to have made his mark outside of Nebraska, although he did work in Nebraska broadcasting. That would be an example of somebody who is at that level and in that set of circumstances beyond the level of what's operating in the state. Now, some of the folks who are in the Hall of Fame are individuals who are very nationally known names. They are individuals such as Johnny Carson or Dick Cavett or Tom Brokaw. And now I see some people will probably say to themselves, well, how could it be Tom Brokaw? We know he's from South Dakota. Well, Tom Brokaw got his first long-time professional job as a full-time person in Omaha, which he is very grateful for and talks about that. So under the rules, since he worked for a while in Nebraska broadcasting, he is a person who would be qualified to be able to do that. And that's the set of circumstances, depending upon the people who nominate individuals for this set of circumstances, how they find themselves in that level of operation and the kinds of things that they deal with to be able to make sure that they understand that this person has made a major contributions, whether it's in the state or whether it's in some other kind of location. What I'm going to do here is to go over to the screen here and bring up, this is the Nebraska Broadcasters Association website. And if you want to have a reference to it at some other point, what you can see is that it is www.ne, that's like Nebraska-BA for Broadcasters Association.org. And then you can go to the Hall of Fame. And now you can see who some of the folks are who are in the Hall of Fame, and they are done by year. The first year, they took in a number of individuals who are members of the Hall of Fame, were what they refer to as broadcasters of the year, individuals who they said, well, okay, we've decided to give these people a level of recognition prior to the time that they started up with the Hall of Fame. So those people came in as what are referred to as charter members in 1972. And then after that, they started to move through the process. In 1973, they only put in one individual, but after that, the formula became that there would only be two people, except, of course, that you get to 1 year, if you look at it, it's 1990, in which they get in three people for a particular reason that people sometimes are interested in why they did that. And the answer is that there was a discussion among the people who were on the selecting committee at that point, because Foster May, who was the person who's listed there, was an individual who they thought was deserving, but they knew they couldn't find anybody to accept the award, no member of the family and so forth. And that was true. They decided to put him in anyway at that point, and subsequently, interestingly enough, 5 or 6 or 7 years later, they did find a member of his family, so it was the reason that they had done that. Now, if you go through and look at some of these folks, you say, well, okay, who are these people and what are their contributions have been over a period of time? So what I can kind of do is to run through some of these folks and tell you a little bit about them so that you are aware of what that is. And if you are interested in generic history of broadcasting in Nebraska, if you track through with some of these folks, you can find some information about that, and that gives you a kind of an idea. And then we'll look at one person in depth just to give you an indication of what's there. Just for your future frame of reference, if you happen to be able to separate this out, you see that some of the ones that are more recent have the names that are in red. That means that they are in red because the videotape presentation, which is prepared for the presentation ceremony, it's a banquet in which the governor and other dignitaries usually attend, actually is attached to this. So if you have the right kind of a software, you can go into the internet site and you can say, well, you know, I'd kind of like to know something about, let's look at 1994 there, I'd like to look at Tom Brokaw, and you can actually just play back the presentation that was done for Tom Brokaw at the time. Our current executive director, Marty Riebenschneider, who is based in Omaha, is a person who is very interested in the history of broadcasting, and he has been able to maneuver some things in terms of the way that the association operates its sites so that you now can go with all of those things. The presentations, as you might imagine, are ones that are very nice because, although it depends how far back they go and the materials that they have, it's a set of circumstances. They go back a little bit and they do a short recapitulation or summary of what the person's career was and what their background is. The formula is that they ask the person's station that they are identified with to prepare the material. Two reasons for that, one of which is that they probably have some of the material, and secondly, then there is no chance, at least in the most logical cases, of somebody making a mistake. In other words, if the person worked at Channel 3 in Omaha, Tom Brokaw, the tape was done by Channel 3 in Omaha, and there are no references that are incorrect because obviously they're dealing with all of their own records as a part of it. When one looks at the information here, the red ones then are the ones that the playback. The ones that are in black do not have a playback, and those are the earlier ones. We are working gradually on that. We have an oral history project that interviews some of these individuals from the past, and we will be editing down some of that material to roughly a 5 to 6 minute interview so that if you go on that, you can see some of the material. See some of these folks. I personally think, and I appear at the university in a mass media history course, that it is very interesting to be able to go back over a period of time and actually see and hear an individual who is a historic figure make a presentation. So you say, well, it's nice to kind of talk about Tom Brokaw, but I know about Tom Brokaw. I've seen him on the news. I'm pretty familiar with Tom Brokaw. If he walked in the front door, I would know who he was, okay? But if you look at some of the other folks there, now 1993 is Walt Kavanaugh. Walt Kavanaugh is a guy who was on KFAB in Omaha as the early morning news director for 40 years. And as the saying goes, most people recognize his voice. Not many people recognize his appearance because he is a radio individual as a part of the discussion. But the ability is, if you want to see what Walt Kavanaugh looks like, I guess you can go in now and play back the tape and you can get some kind of an idea as a part of that. Now, just before we go into some of these kinds of things, what I'm going to try to do is to play a tape which is about one such person. I had discussed the possibilities of playing several, and then I was organized a little bit better by the people at the Historical Society and suggested that I would probably not leave enough time for questions at the end, so I'm only going to do one at this stage of the game. And the person that I'm going to deal with is somebody that you probably all have never heard of. And the reason that I'm going to do that is because you've never heard of this person probably. This person spent a fair amount of time in Lincoln and Omaha and other places. But he's not Dick Cavett, and he's not Johnny Carson, and he's not Tom Brokaw. So if we can switch, please, over to the tape machine at this point, we'll see what we can come up with.
a 2,000-foot transmitter tower, the old cathedral radio, management, family life, changing locations, and teeing off on the 18th hole. These are all aspects of a life that has been instrumental in the creation of the broadcasting industry, truly one of the pioneers. Dietrich Dirks has seen the golden age of radio turn into the influential medium it is today, and television blossom into the largest entertainment informational industry known. Dietrich Dirks is originally from Nebraska, born in the southeast corner of the state near Auburn on July 14th in 1902. Dietrich graduated from Hildreth High School in 1920, then continued his education at the University of Nebraska, choosing business administration as his major course of study.
You and I, versus I, Nebraska. Oh, my. N-E-B-R-A-S-K-U. Oh, there is no place like Nebraska. Dear old Nebraska, you, where the girls are.
Dee, as he was known to most people, was multi-talented and made his mark at UNL by helping to introduce the popular game day song, There Is No Place Like Nebraska. As part of a quartet wearing white pants and using megaphones, Dee and his fellow Glee Club members sang as this tune made its debut at a football game in the fall of 1924. After graduation in 24, Dee spent time traveling around the country, singing at various Chautauqua functions. Shortly after his tours ended, he landed his first broadcasting job at KFAB Radio in Lincoln. Not only was KFAB his first broadcasting career opportunity, but KFAB was also where Dietrich met his wife, Ada. Ada Bell had worked at other radio stations, then went to KFAB where she met Dietrich. A romance ensued, and they were married in Lincoln on December 2nd, 1936. Dee and Ada then had 2 children, John and Linda. John is now located in Sioux City, and Linda resides in Poway, California. Eventually, Dee enjoyed a full-time career at KFAB and moved up to program director, working under Gail Grubb. He got a taste of on-air work at KFAB as one of his duties included play-by-play football announcing. Dee's hard work paid off, and after about a year as program director, he became manager at KFAB. Dee was a personable man who made friends wherever he went. Longtime friend and co-worker Alvin Smith remembers working with Dee.
Well, I first met Dee at KFAB in Lincoln, Nebraska, where I was a radio operator. I didn't even consider myself an engineer in those days. As the man behind the controls to keep things running, so to speak. I worked in master control and did some studio work, and also worked out to the transmitter. And Dee was the big boss. He was the man that kept the place running. That was back in 1936, I think is correct. And any time that I wanted anything from Dee, all I had to do was ask, and that was it. And we worked very closely together through the years.
In the 30s, Dietrich took a trip up to Sioux City, Iowa. He seemed to have liked what he found because Dee, in conjunction with the Kelly family, decided to start a new station. In 1935, Sioux City's second radio station, KTRI, went on the air. Dee later moved north and worked as KTRI's general manager. After approximately 10 years, Dietrich Dirks started making plans for the third Sioux City radio station. By 1948, KCOM was on the air, and Dietrich took up post as KCOM's general manager president. Coincidentally at that time, Dee's friend Al Smith had also moved north and was working at KSCJ, Sioux City's first radio station.
My second connection, so to speak, with Dee was in Sioux City. He came to Sioux City in conjunction with the Tribune newspaper to build a radio station. Anyhow, we had to survey the land from the very beginning, build a building, put in the equipment, and I was working on that end while Dee was lining up programming, studios, and people to run the station.
In 1954, Dee sold his interests in KCOM as he was experimenting with a new aspect of the broadcasting industry, television. Dietrich Dirks and William Perkins, publisher of Sioux City's Journal newspaper, jointly applied for the Channel 4 television license in 1954. The application was approved, and Sioux City's first TV station made plans to be on the air that August 15th. Al Smith recalls the first attempt to get KTIV on the air.
Right, well, I think that's the day that stands out in my life, the day we didn't go on the air at Channel 4. We were hoping to get on the air for the World Series in 1954. I was having much difficulty in getting what I would call a decent signal. What really caused the problem was a tree between the studio tower and the transmitting tower. We had them add 40 more foot to the tower, and then we got over the tree and we went on the air about the next week. I will say we missed the World Series due to a tree.
As general manager of KTIV, Dee was a part of many firsts. KTIV was Sioux City's first TV station and boasted the country's first Vidicon camera chain. In 1959, KTIV carried NBC's first full-color series, Bonanza. That same year, KTIV News received national recognition by winning the RTNDA for Best News Story. News director Ken Wayman and Dietrich traveled to Denver to receive this national honor.
By Ken Wayman in Denver, Colorado. He made a trip there, and he brought the award back to Sioux City, the traveling trophy. And as you see in the picture, it's Dietrich Dirks and Ken Wayman, two very happy people for their endeavors.
In 1965, construction started on KTIV Channel 4 and KTVT Channel 9's joint project, a 2,000-foot antenna transmitter tower. At the time, this was the world's second largest man-made structure. During his years at KTIV, Dee also hired a young, enthusiastic broadcasting student by the name of Tom Brokaw. Tom worked at the station, gaining experience while going to classes. Tom Brokaw remembers his early days at KTIV during an interview on the Today Show.
Station in Sioux City, commercial television station, KTIV, where I did all manner of things, including Sunshine Club highlights. Which I would,
Sunshine Club highlights?
Club highlights. I would interview various civic club members from around the community who would come in and talk to us about bake sales that they were going to be having the following Sunday, or
Who's the president?
Beauty contest of one kind. That's right, all manner of things. The county fair that was coming up, the Sunshine Club highlights, brought to you by the Sunshine Food Markets.
Hi, Sunshine.
And then I would do the Miller Kidder Chevrolet commercials that night between the weather and the news. Now I'm going to tell you one more broadcast.
Back in 1961, I was hired by Dietrich Dirks as a kind of all-purpose man at KTIV in Sioux City. I was the booth announcer. I did commercials live in the 10 o'clock news block. I read the noon news, and I did the Saturday night news and the weather on Sunday nights. Now, I didn't do any of that terribly well, but then Mr. Dirks didn't have to pay me very much either. He was a real patriarch in our little broadcasting family, a father figure, if you will. And what I remember best about him is that he had a very strong sense of public service for the greater Siouxland area through his Channel 4 television station. It really kind of set a standard for me for what I then came to expect from other general managers along the way. I'm especially grateful to him now for giving me the opportunity when I was an untrained student from the University of South Dakota. It allowed me to complete my education and to get started in this career of a television journalist. Now, thanks, Mr. Dirks, I have been able to find other work along the way. So, Mr. D, congratulations on your election to the Nebraska Broadcasters Hall of Fame.
Throughout the years and Dee's numerous pursuits, there was always an underlying dedication to the broadcast industry as a whole. He realized that the future of this industry was dependent on the pioneers of that time. Paramount on Dee's long list of ideals was the simple concept of sharing new thoughts and ideas. Cooperation between stations was a useful and necessary tool if the industry was to grow and prosper. Dietrich's son, John Dirks, talks about Dee's feeling towards the industry.
He was very excited about it. It was, to use a cliche and not coin a phrase, it was his life. He enjoyed pioneering and implementing ideas. And of course, coming from me, it would be biased, I suppose, but I don't think anybody didn't like him, or at least respect him.
While still at KFAB Radio, Dietrich Dirks, along with other industry leaders, came together to share thoughts, ideas, and experiences. From this, the Nebraska Broadcasters Association was formed. As a testament to Dietrich Dirks' commitment, he was named the first Nebraska Broadcasters Association president, holding the office in the years 34 and 35. He also made his mark on a national scale. He served 2 terms in the board of directors for the National Association of Broadcasters, was a member of the executive committee, chair of the NAB Research Committee, and chair of the Sales Management Committee. Dietrich Dirks was a leader in the broadcast industry. His long list of accomplishments include bringing television to the Sioux City area, his contributions both locally and nationally to broadcasting, the numerous stations directly and indirectly affected by his decisions and ideas.
As Dee's life was television and community service. Now, that may sound funny to say put it that way, but he really reached out to the community. In the Y, he was responsible for building the Y in Sioux City, the new Y building, and dozens of other things. And for recreation, he liked to play golf.
I often, when I'm around town, somebody says, "Oh yes, I worked for your dad," or "He gave me my first job," and seem to remember him fondly.
From the earliest days of radio and TV to the present, Dietrich Dirks has continued to make an impression. The Nebraska Broadcasters Association is proud to recognize Dietrich Dirks in the Hall of Fame. Thank you for your dedication.
Mine is treat everyone fairly and always honestly.
Well, I can say in one word, he's a gentleman.
The reason that I decided to play that was because this is an individual who was the first president of the Nebraska Broadcasters Association. I went to Sioux City about 10 years ago to do an interview with Mr. Dirks, and he was at that point around 90. And we went over to the television station that he founded, and because I had worked an arrangement with one of the management people who was a graduate of the University of Nebraska Broadcasting Program to use their facilities to be able to do this. And it was sort of interesting to see the people in the station because they all came in and sort of clustered around and looked at him because they all realized that without him, they didn't have jobs. They didn't have a facility. They didn't have anything. And they had heard about him for years and years and years, but they had never seen him. And at 90, he was an individual who still had, as I've described on this tape, as my colleague you know from the University, Rick Galloway, who is an excellent air personality and does a really fine job. Mr. Dirks has that kind of a voice, and at 90 years old, he still had that kind of a voice, and he could still do that kind of material. He died, by the way, about 18 months ago at the age of 101, and so it seems to me that one of the considerations in terms of what we are about here is probably the sort of thing that would be useful to understand that kind of a long-term continuum. The other consideration that I thought it might be worthwhile to be able to deal with Mr. Dirks is because he is an individual who is very well known, but probably pretty much in the distant past, and he is not as well known as the Johnny Carson, Dick Cavett, Tom Brokaw, or even some of the local air personalities that are well known. Generally speaking, I guess it's probably worthwhile to point out that if you look at the list of individuals, you find some folks who are primarily folks who we would recognize because they are on the air personalities. Some people are journalists, news reporters. There are some people who are basically only writers. There are some individuals who are primarily engineers or technical people. So it's a rather wide range of the kind of individuals who are involved with the process that's part of that. So let me, if it's possible here, to cruise through some of the names, and I'll give you sort of a one-line recognition of who some of these folks are. And then when we get to the time where you'd like to ask questions, if you'd like to ask questions about more than these folks or perhaps some other things individually, I would be glad to be able to do that as well. I have a copy of the material here, so I'm going to let you look at the screen up here, but I'm going to be looking at the material I have here. Charlie Arno is a individual who was a premier person with ABC Radio News. And he was an individual who was very well known in the 50s, 60s, and 70s for doing radio news. Ralph Bodine is an individual from Omaha. Mr. Bodine is the person who thought up the multiple radio news formats. So, for example, if you travel around the country over the years and you hear ABC News, but it's different in different areas and different stations, he invented the idea of having the news written in different styles for news talk stations, for music stations, for rock and roll stations, and so forth. Dick Chapin, of course, is from Lincoln. He is an individual who I saw about an hour and a half ago. He is a very prominent individual in terms of the Stewart Broadcasting operations. He has been in Lincoln for a number of years. He has, I think he's now in his 52nd year of broadcasting, and he's still working as a media broker. Lyle DeMoss is a person that some people in eastern Nebraska would remember as a radio personality, but also a television personality. He made many contributions, starting out in a station which no longer exists, KGBZ in York, but ending up as a person who did television programs about cooking. L.L. Hilliard is Les Hilliard from KOLT in Scottsbluff. Les Hilliard was one of the premier people who took the KOLT operation into Scottsbluff and radio in the 1930s and changed it from a former call sign, and got that KOLT call sign, by the way, off of a military ship that was in dry dock, and took a long time to be able to get that off. Merle Jones was a vice president of CBS Radio, primarily a radio individual. Floyd Calber is a person who died within the last year. He was the news director at Channel 3 in Omaha in the period from about 1949 through 56. He went on to WMAQ in Chicago for a number of years. He was the co-anchor with Jane Pauley when she first started out. Then she went with NBC for a while, retired, and then came back to WLS in Chicago. His son, Mick Calper, is a very sophisticated videographer who is now based in Honolulu. Bob Thomas is Robert E. Thomas from Norfolk. Last week, on Thursday, a week ago, Bob Thomas received the Broadcast Pioneer Award, which is a cooperative venture of the University of Nebraska Broadcasting and College of Journalism and Mass Communications and the Nebraska Broadcasters Association. It was invented about 5 or 6 years ago for people who have made long-term excellence. And the people who have gotten that award, and I'm going to smile as I say this, virtually everybody who's gotten that award has been able to do really outstanding things for, I am not making this up, 50 years at least. Okay? So when you folks think that you're just kind of, working your way through the world here, why, if you haven't done 50 years, well, I guess you got a ways to go on some of the kinds of things. John Gillen Jr. is the person who put Channel 6 on the air in Omaha. He was famous as the guy with the rose in the lapel, who always wore a fresh rose in his lapel every day. He died in his 40s because he basically, I think, operated, as far as I can tell from the historical materials, 27 hours a day. But he was an individual whose background was very, very prominent nationally. Jim Ebel was the general manager of KOLN-TV, KGIN-TV in Lincoln. Many people don't realize that he had a master's degree in electrical engineering and was one of the government's premier negotiators in international telecommunications frequency allocations. He would travel to Geneva, Switzerland for months at a time and listen to the simultaneous translation and handle the technology stuff. Frank Fogarty, if I had a little bit more time, I would play some of the Frank Fogarty material. Frank was the president of and general manager of WWAM-FM-TV in Omaha, head of Meredith Broadcasting, a person who, after retired, went over to the Broadcasters Association as the executive director, but was an individual who is incredibly well-connected in Omaha, very prominent, and the person who the word social responsibility was probably a second nature. Most people recognize the name of Lyle Bremser. In our building, which is across the street from this building, the Anderson Hall, there is a Lyle Bremser room, which is where the plaques for the Nebraska Broadcasters Association hang. Mr. Bremser, when you explain to students, they say, well, I kind of heard of him, but I'm not too sure. And you say he did every Nebraska football game from 1939 to 1983. And every Thanksgiving when we play back the Johnny Rogers run through those people at Oklahoma and the game of the century, they never play the network audio. They always play Lyle Bremser's Johnny the Jets on their shoes. Okay. I always remind young people that Mr. Bremser was the general manager of the station. He wasn't only the sports person. He assigned himself to do what he wanted to do because when you're the boss, you can do that. Okay. Howard Schuman is the person who put KFOR in Lincoln on the air in David City. He also put KLMS on the air in Lincoln. And KLMS in Lincoln, as some people, and depending on where you fit into this, think of that as Lincoln's music station. Currently, they like to call it Lincoln's Most Sports. Actually, it stands for Lucille M. Schumann, who is Howard's wife, and that's how they got the call letters at the time. Okay. Roger Larson, I mentioned earlier, of course, is the longtime general manager of KFOR. He is a very prominent individual in the community. He still serves in many ways. I've seen him this morning as well. His set of circumstances happens to be with the Stewart Broadcasting for a number of years. He retired from that and has gone to work first at the National Bank of Commerce and now Wells Fargo in community relations. Howard Stonecker is a person who is the individual who was the general manager of what was then in Omaha WWAM, WWFM, WWTV. Mr. Stonecker is a person whose primary background was in advertising and broadcasting, and people sometimes say, did you know that he was essentially a superstar private pilot? And I do happen to know that. He actually had apparently a charter license to do that. Owen Sadler was the first, I guess I should go down a little bit. Well, let me skip across the top to 1988 just for the convenience of this. Martha Bolson is a person who did a program which was on both radio and television for the commercial company called Tidy House. It was a housekeeping kind of show. If you've seen the program done some years ago on Omaha television, they do this. And Martha Bolson, in her time, brought in a lot of money. I say pleasantly that Martha Bolson's program ability made some people a fortune in terms of some materials. Steve Murphy is a premier broadcast journalist, longtime leader in freedom of information in the state. He started at WOW Radio, fresh out of Creighton University in 1948. He concluded his full-time career with the same station in 1990. Having been through various positions in the station, he continued to work with them for another 10 years as a consultant, and he died about 2 years ago. Todd Storrs is Robert Todd Storrs. He is the individual who thought up, according to the textbooks that we deal with one other person, the so-called modern radio format of how you put things together. When feature programming went from radio to television in the 1950s, Todd Storrs bought radio stations when other people were selling them, figured out what the format was, and did that. We have a picture of him in our building across the street. He is a person who died, unfortunately, at the age of 39. He also was a person like Johnny Gillen who probably burned himself out too quickly, and his father, Robert Herman Storrs, who's also in the Hall of Fame, took over the company and ran it for another 25 years. Very interesting set of circumstances where the father takes over after the son dies and keeps the business going. Gene Hughes is one of the two individuals who are in both the Press Association and the Broadcasters Association Hall of Fame. Mr. Hughes is the person who is the publisher of the Norfolk Daily News. He's also the guy who wound the wire around the coffee cans to get WJAG on the air. And people say, well, how could he do that? Well, he was interested in that, and we've had an individual do a thesis about some of that, and he basically what it amounts to is he used the newspaper to keep building up the radio operations until it could stand on its own, and kept going from there. Foster May is a person I mentioned a little bit ago. He's the individual who the catch line was, "Take it away, Foster May," because he did the Man on the Street program. He's also the person, and we actually have heard this, who got a bank robber to surrender to him, not the police, and he recorded it. Now you see why he's in the Hall of Fame, probably. Folks who have been around Lincoln know that Bob Taylor is not Bob Taylor the actor, it's Bob Taylor, the news director at Channels 10 and 11. Bob was active at Channels 10 and 11 after coming from KLMS in the 50s. He was there from 1961 to 1981. He was the news director during that time. Merrill Workhoven is the person who sometimes is referred to as the person who is a recipient of Johnny Carson's kindness. He's the guy who hired Johnny Carson in Omaha, worked with Johnny Carson in Omaha. He's the guy who, some years ago, when he was traveling across the West Coast, stopped to see Johnny, his old friend, and Johnny took care of him, was nice to him, and Merrill was having trouble with his car, and then went on up the coast and came back, and Johnny just plain said to Merrill, "Your car isn't very good, there's a new Buick in the driveway, drive that back to Nebraska." Fairly well-known individual. Dick Cavett, of course, we mentioned, of course, it's convenient because he's in Lincoln today. The person who graduated from Lincoln High, a gymnast, went to Yale, wrote for The Tonight Show, and so forth. Ken Elkins is an engineer, a technician, a guy who actually can go down and build a video switcher for you. And he is the president of the Pulitzer Broadcasting Corporation for a number of years. Helen Duhamel is the person who essentially brought television to the western part of the state. Duhamel Broadcasting is based in Sioux Falls. Mrs. Duhamel was a person who The family business was a sort of a department store in Rapid City. She bought a radio station in the 20s on her own. When it was going under, she made something out of it, kept it going, and operated a broadcasting concern over here on the side for her own purposes. Put the television station on and put a satellite station on, KDUH-TV. It's licensed to Scottsbluff now. It was licensed to Hay Springs for a number of years because she could remember what it was like living in Gordon when she was a young woman and dealing with that. Then you, of course, see Dietrich Dirks, whom you know. Walt Kavanaugh, we have mentioned, as the person, the 40-year news director of KFAB in Omaha. Larry Rice is a person who is in Ainsworth. He is the person who, a nationally prominent individual based in Ainsworth. It's sort of like some folks you don't necessarily see. I traveled with him one time to Washington, D.C., and we were doing some work on behalf of the association, and we came down for breakfast at the hotel, and it was like about 6:45, and Larry comes in the front door, and we go, "Larry, where have you been?" Well, he'd been out standing, this is before cell phones, out in a phone booth across the street from the White House, calling in the morning show on his own station, talking about what it was like to be as a feature, you know, at 5 o'clock in Washington. We decided he was a really committed radio guy in terms of the kinds of things that are part of that. So these are folks that are part of it. Move it down. See if I have just the right touch here as a part of that. And you can see some other names that are part of that. For example, down here you do see Johnny Carson. You see Howard Kennedy, Ron Hull, many of you know of, Mel Maines, many of you know, Robert H. Storrs, that you know. Lou Hunter is a person who is an individual who has a writer's workshop based in Superior. Again, he's the retired chair of the screenwriting department at UCLA. He has written a number of nationally award-winning scripts. He has never sold the home in Superior, although he technically lives in California for the last 40 years. He comes back to Nebraska as a part of the kinds of things that are involved with that. Don Meyer, under 2000, is the guy who is the producer of the Wild Kingdom series. He's based in Chicago, and if you've ever seen the Wild Kingdom series, I'm supposed to say Mutual of Omaha Wild Kingdom series because it's co-owned by the insurance company and by Mr. Meyer. That's the situation that's part of that. And of course, 1997, you know Jack McBride there, who is the individual who operated our public television network in Nebraska, probably the finest network there is of the kind, from 1954 until his retirement in 1996, but he's also still somebody that you see in Lincoln. So, you know, if you can look at some of those kinds of names, and I'm supposed to stop at this stage of the game and see if there are questions or other things that people would like me to bring up, so let me do that, please. I'm following John's instructions here. Please.
When you started off earlier and said KFAB was from Lincoln, and then when did they move to Omaha?
Well, KFAB was a station which was originally founded in Lincoln and operated from the time they went on the air in the early 1920s until the period right after World War II, and they at that point had studios in both Lincoln and Omaha, and in 1949 the FCC told them to pick one or the other, and that would be it. Right now in Lincoln there's the Antelope Valley Project, which is right south of the fairgrounds. They've just torn down a building which used to be the University Police Headquarters, and that was the KFAB transmitter site. So up until about 6 months ago, you could go by this building, somewhat modified, of course, and you say, well, that's where the KFAB towers happen to be. It was owned by the same folks. They just decided that they would capitalize on the fact that Omaha is a bigger area. Probably was going to be financially more rewarding for them to be able to do that. And you've brought up a very interesting point. The question is, when was KFAB in Lincoln? People will look at that and they'll say, well, that can't be right. There must be something wrong about that. It actually was in Lincoln for a period of time, and it was co-owned. I'll just hold this up. It's not very easy to see. This is a page from the 1937 Journal Star. It's KFAB, KOIL, and KFOR doing things at the State Fair. This is allegedly, according to the newspaper advertisement, the first time that they had a complete radio studio at the State Fair that you could wander up to and see these kinds of things. Certainly that's something that was copied by other folks. My wife, when she worked with Channel 10 for a number of years, operated that kind of a situation on behalf of Channel 10. But this is 1937, and you probably recognize, if you are someone who follows Nebraska broadcasting, that KFAB, of course, still exists in Omaha. KOIL still exists in Omaha, and KFOR still exists in Lincoln. The thing that you might not quite picture is that right now in 2005 we talk about the fact that there's this media consolidation and all these people own the same things and so forth. These three stations were all owned by the same people in 1937, and there weren't that many stations on the air at that time. There was no FM, there was no TV, and they were all owned by the same things. So as a lesson from history, which I should say, since I'm interested in history, that, some of these kinds of things come around the second time to be able to deal with that. Please.
Was Mike Krasnick's name on the list?
There's numbers of people who are nominated for the Hall of Fame who are not yet in, and the thing I usually point out to folks is that probably everybody who's nominated is well qualified to get in. Mike Krasny was the news director of Channel 10, actually before Channel 11. He was active in the late 1950s. He died of Bright's disease in 1961 and was succeeded as the news director by Bob Taylor, who at that time was doing the weather. He also had a brother who was a network producer. So those folks are back there. Just one of those kinds of things where you know there are plenty of folks who ought to get in, and we'll see if they get in someday. Please.
You mentioned qualification standards association with a commercial broadcast operation. Could you then discuss Father Williams?
Well, it didn't say commercial station. It said broadcasting in Nebraska. Okay. Father Williams is a Jesuit priest on the faculty of Creighton University, very much of an innovator in the time. Father Williams produced public television programs for the ETV network. He also, interestingly enough, was the individual who, before Channel 6 went on the air, they bought equipment and they put it in the auditorium at Creighton University, and he helped them figure out how to do television. So Channel 6 as a studio operation was operating under his aegis at Creighton University prior to 1949. Now, Jack McBride says that at one point the people at Channel 6 decided they should give that to Creighton University, and they turned it down, and he thinks that's kind of an odd circumstance, but that's interesting variable. Jack is a graduate of Creighton University with a master's degree from Northwestern University. Of course, I can also tell you that the University of Nebraska turned down an FM station from KFAB in 1950, so it took us to 1970 to get the station on. So there's some of these kinds of things that are out there as a part of it. So yeah, it can be anybody. It can be a public station, it can be a commercial station, and it can be a part of that. And although Father Williams was probably not somebody who was employed by a commercial station, he certainly was a person who produced programs for both commercial and public television programs. A very interesting individual with a typical producer's ability to do very sharp visualization. Please.
I can't remember his name, the guy on Channel 6 that did the farm reports.
Mel Hansen.
Mel Hansen is there, right? He's under 1998. Mel Hansen is a guy who came to Omaha as a bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Iowa, really pioneered agricultural broadcasting on Channel 6. They made a lot of money from that over a period of time. He actually goes back there. If you look at some of the stuff, if you go to the Johnny Carson clip on our site here, Johnny Carson refers to the fact that his set was in the corner and Mal Hansen's set was here and Don Keogh's set was here and so forth. Don Keogh, by the way, is the guy who went on to become president of the Coca-Cola Company. All these people were working at Channel 6 at the same time in 1950. And so if you look at those circumstances and you go, gee, that's kind of interesting as to where those people came from and how that fits together. So, please.
Quick question. I've met Lou Hunter, and I'm very aware of his career as a screenwriter and teacher. I have some friends who are filmmakers who've worked with him, but I'm not aware that he has a broadcasting background. Actually, see what I mean?
Well,
I think of him as affiliated with the film industry.
Lou Hunter's actual best claim to fame is that he's done television programs that have been rewarded with Emmys. So the issue is, you're quite right, certainly. The question is Lou Hunter somebody who has a broadcasting background as well as a motion picture background? He has both, certainly. But what he actually did was a number of scripts, and some of them are motion pictures for television. And he has gotten Emmys from the Television Academy of Arts and Sciences as a television writer. Now, the other part of it is, if you really want to go with that, when he was a student at Wesleyan, he actually worked on the floor crew at Channel 10. So if you want to say that he does that, he has a master's degree in broadcasting from Northwestern and a master's degree in film from UCLA. He has 2 master's degrees. But some of the people who know him, did some of the nomination work on this, go, well, this is just Lou. He's the guy who was the floor crew guy out at Channel 10 back there somewhere. And he takes great pride in that, by the way. He's very, very intrigued with that. Please?
I just noticed, I don't know if you've got the compilation list, but it seems though that WWW combined have a disproportionate number of representation up there.
You know, that's it's interesting that I can go through and do the calculations with you in terms of some of that kind of situation. People do move around, but for example, if you look at 1995, you have Jack Payne, who was once with Channel 6, but was also with KFAB. So when you go back and look at these people, well, basically what we do is we indicate how they go across as a part of that and what stations that they are with. There are, if you know enough about it, there are, for example, people who say the WJAG has a disproportionate number of representatives. But some of these stations have been in business a long time, and they have hired really outstanding people who have gone out to be able to do other things. The other consideration, is, of course, is that when you deal with people, their ability to get up the documentation is pretty good. There is a person on the list here who is, let's see, he's under 1981. He's Carl Steffen. Carl Steffen is probably somebody that my friends from the Historical Society and Mary Ellen Ducey, my colleague from the university and the library, would go, oh sure, well that's the Carl Steffen. But maybe people don't deal with that. Carl Steffen was a congressman in Nebraska from 1934 to 1951. He died in office. But before that, he was the news director of WJAG in Norfolk. Before that, he was one of the editorial staff of the newspaper. He worked with my wife's great uncle, Sterling McCaw, who's in the Nebraska Press Association Hall of Fame, the Norfolk Daily News. And Carl Steffen, then in Arthur Thomas, and then in Bob Thomas, and so forth. People go, well, you know, there's 3 or 4 people from that station. So it's a kind of an interesting set of circumstances and variables. You notice we don't list the stations on this, but if you click on this and you go to the ones where we have the bios up, it does go through the bio and it will tell you what stations that we are saying that they are aligned with. And for example, the Lou Hunter reference that we dealt with a moment ago, most people don't think of Lou Hunter as being aligned with Channel 10, but if you count him as with Channel 10, then Channel 10 has or cable NTV in Lincoln has a greater number of representation than you might expect it would be.
Do you have any early, any print material prior to 1940 radio station program? I'm not sure that they exist together, early radio people made. And do you know anything that's successful to get promoted?
You know, I have heard about some things, but unfortunately, people do not save some of those kinds of materials very well. The folks at WJAG in Norfolk, because it's the continuous operation, actually do have some of those kinds of things. You can go back to them, and they can pull stuff out of their files. They had a problem with a flood in Norfolk in the 40s, and so some of the material that they had saved otherwise is not there. But otherwise, they do have a fair amount of material. Now, we the university, the Historical Society, and the Association undertook a campaign in last June, and we put announcements on a number of stations saying, you know, if you happen to have some material, a relative of yours worked in broadcasting and you have some of their material, could you please let us see that? Or could you show us the tapes? We'll make copies of them and give them back to you. And we've gotten some information from that, but a lot of things are in private collections that people have. And sometimes it's they belong to Uncle so-and-so, and we don't know that we have it. So do I know directly where there is a bunch of this material? I do not.
Is there a book that was written about the early history, anything in print?
There is material about the early history of broadcasting in that period of time. There's not a lot of very localized areas. There are very specific things. For example, there's a guy who did a book on local children's television, the University of Alabama Press, I think it is, about 3 years ago, and he refers kind of in passing to a couple of programs in Nebraska, but that's about all in terms of doing that. So it's a situation in which we are trying to go out and restore some of this information and pull it back together. So we're with you in terms of the possibility. Do we have a ton of that material available to us? We do not. Please?
One name that comes up in my mind, I haven't seen it, there's Tom Chase.
Tom Chase did the Uncle Tom Chase to me, who did the Kids Show on Channel 6 in Omaha in the 1950s, is a person who is certainly in that book that I just mentioned about early kids programs, and might well be a candidate in the future. We have a flock of people who've been nominated. Some of them have a lot of documentation, and some do not.
Did
And
he not have quite a radio career prior to that?
he did, but he's best certainly known for the television material as far as I'm aware of it. But if you know more about it, I'd be glad to have you provide whatever insight that you can to go out and look for that consideration. Uncle Tom Chase was right there with our former executive director was a man named Dick Palmquist. He died in 2002, and he also did a program on Channel 6 in those years called Major Action. And I always admired this guy because he could get into his Major Action uniform, you know, probably 40 years after he had done the program. And I always thought that was pretty amazing because we sort of teased him about that one time, and he actually came into a meeting with his Major Action uniform. You know, it's kind of the Space Ranger kind of thing with the epaulets and so forth, and it just shows how far back some of that kind of thing goes. Well, John, I guess I'm to the end of the time, and I thank you very much for your participation, and I hope that this insight has led you to appreciate the social responsibility and the innovations of broadcasting in Nebraska. Thank you.